You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Avram Kivelevich, and I hope you enjoy this episode. You're blowing the dust off the old books. You're trying to find an ancient treasure. Yes, the Antiquarian who has Semicha has arrived. But first, you've heard me on this platform touting NRS, a great company whose many dedicated employees I get to see in action. NRS Pay has recently launched its new cost-cutting program called Cash Discount. The way it works is, any vendor using NRS Pay Cash Discount has their sale register tabulating automatically a dual pricing, which offers customers a choice of a cash payment, which could result in an up to 4% discount over swiping their card. If your business meets the $18,000 a month threshold, there's absolutely no monthly fee to incur. NRS Pay Cash Discount makes it less expensive to accept credit cards, so you'll save money while helping your customers save at the same time. NRS is offering a time-limited deal right now on this state-of-the-art system. You'll get a free card reader with zero hidden fees, no long-term contract, and no early termination fee, which means you can switch your processing plan without penalty. NRS Pay is a proud part of the IDT Corporation that I've been associated with for over 10 years and has integrity built into its corporate DNA. I know its founder, its officers, and salespeople, and they truly stand by their product and will help you with live, stateside-based customer service on any issue or question. Check nrspay.com for more information or call 833-289-2767. And now, the Antiquarian. Clear the dust away. The Antiquarian has Semicha. It's the 8th day of Tevis, and Yitzchak Kolakowski and I are talking about the significance of this day. And it's really an antiquarian feast. In the book known as Megillas Tainas Basra, let me give a little background here. One of the first books that was ever written for dissemination that was not the Torah scrolls, that was not part of Nevi'im and Ksuvim, was Megillas Tainas. Megillas Tainas was a list, sort of like a calendar of days during the period of the second Beis HaMikdash that one would not fast. In other words, it was a Megillah, meaning a scroll that people had, and they knew what are days that they weren't supposed to fast and what days they weren't supposed to conduct eulogies. And in that list, there were a number of days that were considered holidays based on national victories. Many of them were connected to the period that we just exited out of, Hanukkah. And around that time, throughout that period, there was various battles, wars, and issues with the next enemy after the Yevonim, after the Hellenists, was the Tzedukim. So there's a lot of holidays that are considered significant. Those are called Megillas Tainas. Then there is a brisa of Megillas Tainas, not just the list, but the description of why each day is important. For example, why Hanukkah is important. That, of course, is what's found in the Gemara in Shabbos and the Chafal from Ebez, a word-for-word description from what we call the brisa of Megillas Tainas. Then there is a nisbach, sort of an appendix to that, which some can see as sort of a separate book altogether, and it's actually called the Megillah with the list of days you're supposed to fast. And that is called, by scholars, Megillas Tainas Basra, or MTB. Now, in Megillas Tainas Basra, there are a number of days that should be fasting, which actually contradict the days in Megillas Tainas when you shouldn't be fasting. And therefore, there have been scholars that have been summarized by the beautiful article by Rav Shner Lyman, you can find in the JQR, in the Jewish Quarterly Review, where he indicates that there's some that doubt whether there's any provenance. But it's interesting that the great halachas all quote these days when it comes to the days of fasting. Most preeminent, of course, is the Bahag, who quotes from this Megillas Tainas a number of days during the year that people should fast, and people did fast. And included in that list is 3 in a row, at least in most editions, that have the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th of Tevis. And of course, the 10th of Tevis of Yitzchak, we're going to be talking about soon enough. Of course, it's pretty well known what the 10th of Tevis is, the day that the first real major siege of Yerushalayim occurred that actually threatened them to the point that it was going to lead to the destruction, which it did 3 years later. That is the 10th of Tevis. There might be more to the 10th of Tevis than that, as we're discussing. But the 8th is mentioned there as the day that Nichtava HaTorah Yilvanis, or Nitargama HaTorah Yilvanis, Ubay Choshech La'olam Shloisha Yomim. 3 days the Choshech came down. Now, I should just mention in an article that I found today, written by Levi Charitin in the Torah journal Tvunot, he mentions the research of scholars before him that there are other dates, even in the standard classic work of the Orchos Chaim. It's mentioned that this event occurred, the Torah being translated into Greek, occurred on the first day of Tevis, and again with the 3-day darkness that ensued.
I'm sure it took more than a day to
translate it, yes. So I guess that might mean the day it was finished.
It took Rav Aryeh Kaplan, I think, 3-4 months.
Yeah, well, he was an incredible person, and I think God sort of knew the batteries were on the low, and therefore, maybe on high, and therefore he was able to do such incredible things in his short life, things that most people could never even dream of doing. And of course, there's also manuscripts Aryeh Kaplan left. There's books that he wrote for the Weiser Press, books in Kabbalah and Biurim on the Sefer HaBoyer and other things that are just amazing. But Aryeh Kaplan, I think, might be an antiquarian show for another time. There is a book called the Sefer HaTodir, written by Moshe Bar Yukotil of Rome, that says that this occurred on the 5th of Tevis. And of course, there is actual manuscripts of this Megillas Tainis Basra that it might have happened on the 7th. There is a payut from the Yarchem de Rebbe Pinchas, that I'm not that familiar with, but according to that, it's basically a beautiful payut that describes, this is of course a very ancient payut that describes how each month has a holiday, and each holiday, of course, is connected to the stones on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, the Avnei HaChoshen, and it also has the negative things of that month. And when it comes to Tevis, it says it's the 18th day that the negative of the Torah translated into Greek. It's clearly connected to Tevis, Yitzchak, but what the accepted idea is that it was on the 8th day. And there is a Masechta Sofrim that says that this was such a difficult day. It was like the day that when that Targum was finished, it was like the day that the ego itself was produced. And I think the Masechta Sofrim says because it just was not able to be translated Kol Tzarchov, that it wasn't able to be translated properly. And so we are left with an interesting statement, because those of our listeners that are familiar with the Gemara in Megillah that speaks about the miracle of what occurred, right? The Gemara in Megillah knows about this event. It talks about how Talmi had gathered these 70 Zikanim and put them in separate rooms, and he told them, you must translate the Torah for me. They didn't know what to do, but they all went into the rooms, and the Gemara Megillah indicates that a miracle occurred. Every single one of them, who of course was translated, of course, translation, you would expect there should be differences between each person, but what occurred instead was exactly the same from all 70, and there were 18 differences which the Gemara Megillah expounds on, or a brisa in the Masechtas Megillah expounds on. Most prominent one, of course, the very first words of the Torah, Bereshis bara Elokim, sounds like Bereshis is a separate God, and Bereshis created Elohim, and of course this was changed to Elokim bara Bereshis, God created the beginning. So these 18 differences were significant. Some of them are a little bit amusing. But what's strange, Yitzchak, is that the Gemara Megillah doesn't indicate that it was a terrible day. The Gemara Megillah looks at it as something positive, as a day that, yes, there was a threat, but not a day necessarily to fast. And here we have these later sources.
The Shloishes Mei Choshech is not mentioned there in...
Right, not mentioned in the Gemara Megillah. So we have in the Masechtas Tainis Basra and Masechtas Sofrim, both really written in the Gaonic period or early Gaonic period, perhaps in the period of the Rabbanan Savroi, very early, but still there seems to have been a shift from the time the Gemara was written to a couple hundred years later, where the statements are quite negative about this event, that the fact that the Torah was translated. And there is, of course, the hagiographic, I'm not sure exactly how we'd refer to it, Yitzchak, the Igeris Aristeus, that is a work that was preserved, I think, in Greek, and then it was translated in Latin, which has a whole story of how this thing happened, a much greater elaboration of the events that occurred. The Igeris Aristeus was translated into Hebrew by the great Italian historiographer Bazari de Medumim, who appended it to his incredible work, the Morainayim, and that is how it became once again well known.
The request was that they should all be the same. So being they all should be the same is an indication that they didn't want any chidushim. They wanted just a translation.
Okay.
As opposed to, I remember seeing this from Rabbi Charles Kahana. He wrote a translation of the Chumash called the Torah Yeshara, and I remember seeing that in the library, in the English library at Or Sameach in Yerushalayim, reading the Hakdama that he wrote, and he asked the question, which I'm sure is not his chiddush, I'm sure others have asked, but why we mourn, why we pravavelis over the Septuagint, and why?
Right, Septuagint again is the Greek of 70. Septuagint meaning 70. The writers.
70. Yeah. And then as opposed to, he compared it and contrasted it to the Targum Unclus, to the Aramaic translation that we find
that we elevate to the point that we say it comes venerated from Sinai.
Yeah, and it's something that's venerated and is used liturgically still in the Yemenite communities. They still use it liturgically, and it was classically used liturgically. So what's the difference between these two? And what Rabbi Charles Kahana?
Can I throw in a question?
Yeah.
I don't know if Kahana's answer will answer this. I say Kahana because, as you mentioned to me before, he is actually the father of the famous or infamous Rabbi Meir Kahana. There's a question, of course, that the Yaris Dvash, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, asks, which is the Torah in the beginning of Sefer Devarim talks about Be'er HaTorah Azos, that the Torah was supposed to be translated into 70 languages, and that one of the most important things that the Klal Yisrael did as they went into Eretz Yisrael was the Seifrim who wrote on these stones the translation of the Torah. And there were translations there made maybe in the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu in those last days of his life. And it seemed to have been something very important according to Chazal, the way they explained those psukim. That makes the question even stronger.
You're right. It makes it even a bigger question.
Right.
It seems like we do want the Torah translated. We do want the Torah to be spread to the whole world. The Torah was not intended only to be for a small parochial ethnic group. The Torah was intended for the whole world. I was listening to a talk from a friend of mine. He said, the Muslims often say that, the Torah was only for the Yahud, for the Jews, but that the Quran was for the whole world. And then this friend of mine said, no, the Torah is for the whole world. The Erev Rav, even though they're often presented negatively, they're part of the Klal Yisrael. I remember, I think Rabbi Victor Miller, Chusi Galeno, said that the conversion of the Erev Rav was the biggest Kiddush Hashem in history, that so many millions of people joined the Klal Yisrael and were Makabel the Torah, even though they were not perfect. But we're getting way off.
Okay, but yes. Anyway, I didn't want to stop your train of thought, but I just wanted to strengthen the question of Rav Kahana, which of course is against Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, which is, let's call it the Weltskasha, is what's so bad about it, right? So what does he say as an answer?
He says is that the Targum Unclus is not a literal translation. And neither was his translation, but it's rather a synthesis of the Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. The Torah Shebal Peh is like the neshama, and the Torah Shebiksav is the guf. So when the Choshech came from the Targum Shivim, it's not because the Torah was translated, but that only Torah Shebiksav was translated. And that's why Badavka Ptolemy wanted to sequester he didn't want a synod of all of these Chachamim to come together and produce something. He wanted each individual to give him the exact same thing at threat of death, because he specifically wanted only the Torah Shebiksav and not the Torah Shebal Peh. But then also you could add to that is that at that point, then the Chumash just became another book on the shelf and wasn't in the elevated
Let me tell
status.
you what you just said to the words of the Chassam Sofer, which I'm showing you on the screen now. The Chassam Sofer says that when the Torah is written in its original language, which is the language that God spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, then of course there are so many myriad possible interpretations that you are able to say, and you're not wrong. And you can say pshat, and you can say drash, you can say remesh, you can say sod, or you can say many possibilities in pshat. Therefore, the Bnei Yisrael are going to, as he says, they're going to be yishmu l'divrei chachamim u'pirushim v'chidosam. They're going to have just an exciting time every single time they learn the psukim of the Torah, because they're going to realize the various possibilities. But once you translate into a language, you need to choose one of those. In other words, when it's in its original form, then it's cryptic, perhaps, but also able incredibly to be so many things every time you look at it, or in a different vein, and every year, or every time you interact. But if you're going to translate, then it's got to be exact. It's got to be a certain kavana, and it becomes pshat shel mikra. Why? Because he says the languages outside of Lashon HaKodesh, they don't have this multi-aspect. They don't have this aspect that it could be many, many things at once. And therefore, you can't possibly do it. Once that happens, even the Bnei Yisrael are into pshat, the pshat shel mikra. In other words, once the Greek interpretation shows one angle, and that becomes the pashut pshat, it reverberates back even among the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And he says that's why you have the beginning of apikorsis at this point. People don't want to listen to Chazal anymore, because what they want, he says, is to have just a simple meaning.
One of my rebbeim, he quoted in English, although he's an expert in the French language and many other languages, a polyglot. He said that there's a French saying that a translator is a traitor. Probably sounds better in French. You can't really capture anything in translation fully. And not only that, but the language changes over time. You know, we look at the different translations of the Tanakh from Lashon HaKodesh to all the different languages, and then the languages change over time. And so you look at, words that King James used that meant what it meant at that time. And again, King James was a group that came together.
It was the greatest scholars of their time, and they really argued about it. And there's a beautiful article in the Atlantic about 35 years ago that I would ask our listeners to try to dig up, that really puts it on the table exactly how these Bible translations work, the amazing scholarship that went into every single one, how each one relied on the one before. I just want to share with you something that Chitrin writes, and I think this is very much relevant to something you were talking about earlier. The Septuagint, the original one, the one that Chazal talked about, became something different once it morphed into various Greek translations to what's known as the Septuagint today. And we know there's thousands of differences between the Tanakh that we have and the Tanakh of Septuagint. The great Gaon Rav Chaim Heller, in one of his books, he actually wrote a chart of all the differences between the Septuagint and Origin and some of the various other differences. So basically what happened is Chazal knew that these differences would get greater and greater. And he says once that happens, they knew that it would become, in many people's eyes, more significant and more authoritative. And I'll just read you in Hebrew what he writes here. He says, the Bible critics especially are very happy with it. And they say the reason is because that is the real Nusach HaTorah, that it's known as the Septuagint. That's the real Nusach HaTorah. The Masorah was actually done afterwards, and therefore it really should not be given historical weight. And their proof to it, Yitzchak, and this is what we're talking about, what their proof was the fact that the Septuagint is extant. They have versions of it that are wrapped in papyrus that they have dated of being over 1,700 years old. Whereas the oldest Ksav Yad they found up until the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll talk about in a second, was only, up until that point, was less than 1,000 years. So that was what they used. And of course, this is why what you mentioned to me earlier today, the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which showed that 60% of the Qumran texts aligned with not the Septuagint, but actually with the Masorah and the Megillos and the Tefillin that were found there. One of the arguments that I guess is still somewhat current I think you said you saw a video that a Christian priest once again was using, despite the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know, by the way, that the reason why the Christians are so darned excited about the Dead Sea Scrolls, even now, although it was found in Eretz Yisrael and it should be completely under the control, those dig and manuscripts should be completely under control of the biblical scholars from Eretz Yisrael. There are Christians who are working on it and are part of this team because to them it was the indicator, in their antiquarian way, to find the proof of the historicity of Jesus. And that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls supposedly proved. I don't think they proved it at all. It did show that there was a Qumran sect and that they seemed to have the type of behaviors that one could say align somewhat with Jesus's disciples, but there's no mention.
Not really. not really.
Right.
And if anything, you find things in the Dead Sea Scrolls that also support. I know it's a machlokes between two of my own rebbeim. Like one of my rebbeim, Rabbi Siegel, he insists that the people in Qumran, the scenes did not accept Torah Shebaal Peh. But then Rabbi Bar Tzadok says, no, they did accept Torah Shebaal Peh, just they rejected the city life and they wanted to be separate from the corruption of Yerushalayim. And they were extremists in other ways, but the way that they write, there's one of the scrolls that talks about Inyanim of Tumah and Tahara, and it echoes very much the style that Chazal used, and that was kind of
so it is very puzzling that Christians today should still utter this type of argument that the Septuagint.
Well, this has been on my mind because I'm not going to mention any names, but I think people might be aware, it was on some radio shows and things, that there was a case of a Ger Tzedek that I was Batapa with. I brought him to Bezdin. I was Basar Kedushin as Chasana, and he was very frum for about 5 years. And he is Verdorben geworden in Gansen, and he went back to a very strange religious cult that he was involved with briefly, in between learning Yiddishkeit for a number of years, and then he was rejected so much he wound up there, and then he tells us that he rejected that. He was totally sincere at the time when he was Megayer, and then he was learning a lot, davening very stark, and he finished Shas and he finished the Zohar Kodesh, and then he decided after finishing Shas, some kind of a crazy Yetzer Hara came to him to go back to the other ways. And one of the things that told a friend of ours that the reason why was because this idea that the Septuagint is actually older, more original or more authentic than what we have in the Masoretic text. It's just so ridiculous. It's hard to believe that anyone could believe that, particularly, again, like we said, after the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a few places where it sides with that. And again, the answer to that could be like Rabbi Siegel says, they're not people who are Makabel Torah Shebaal Peh. So they're not of interest for historical reasons, but not really for religious reasons, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But nonetheless, the historical reasons, like you said, are tremendous because it puts back a Hebrew scripture 1,000 years earlier and before any other manuscripts we know of.
Yitzchak, I think this phenomena of very intelligent people and people we even admire for so many reasons adopting hashkafos or ideas that seem to be illogical and seem to be completely, as we say, abgefragt, completely dismissed by the facts. I think, of course, this is what both of us are seeing in terms of attitudes towards what's happening in Eretz Yisrael, in terms of the significance of the claim of the Bnei Yisrael, of Eretz Yisrael on this country, the significance of the justification of the war. Again, you find people that are intelligent and that you admire. You admire their writing, you admire what they're about, mouthing ideas that seem to be so illogical. And again, I think you see from here that there is, even the best minds choose based on what is necessary for them to choose for other reasons, not just on intellectual ones.
A lot of these things, I think, Al Derech Musar comes from more of a gaiva, because I remember a story. There was a Reform Jewish scholar, I think his name was Binyamin Alexander. It was actually Fulton Sheen, who later became a bishop. When he was a young priest, he was sent to try to debate with this Professor Alexander about some crazy, outlandish theological claims that he made that gained popularity and admiration of heads of state and kings and queens. They gave him various awards. And when Sheen confronted Alexander about this, and Sheen said, maybe we could study together some older texts and compare, and see where you made your mistake. And then Alexander said, if I'm just reading the old books, I'm never going to be famous. But here I made up something that's so crazy that'll make me famous.
Shades of L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah, in the end, Sheen was a lot more famous than Alexander, though.
Let me just add to us here a Medrash Tanchuma, where it's interesting that Moshe Rabbeinu, sort of according to the Medrash, wanted to have more in Ksav. He wanted to have that the Torah Shabbal Peh that you were talking about should be written. I guess, again, Moshe Rabbeinu felt it would, that he was the king of Torah B'Ksav, and of course the king of Torah Shabbal Peh. He says, why can't it be B'Ksav? Why can't we have a written document? And the Medrash gives an incredible answer, which again might reflect on why this is considered a fast day and a day that we should sort of mourn. It says, "Shetzafa Kadosh Baruch Hu she'umas ha'olam asidin l'targem es haTorah lius koren bo Yavonis." They're going to have the Torah translated, and of course that means the original miraculous one turns into the Septuagint that we know. V'heim omrim anu Yisrael vad achshav hamaznayim mu'yan. In other words, they're the ones, the Christians, in other words, saying, this is our Torah. We're the ones that have the right thing. So God says, Atem omrim sha'atem banai, according to the Medrash, you think you're my children? The only people I recognize as my children, again, this fits in with what Kahana was saying, Eini Yodea Elamisha Mistorin Shaliatzlo, the ones that know the mystery, the one that knows the secrets, the things that are not so clear, the things that sound opaque and are difficult, and you have to use the keys of Torah Shabbal Peh to understand. That's the Mishnah that's given al Peh. And therefore, he says, Moshe Rabbeinu, that's why the Torah says, Echtav l'rubei Torasi, you want all this to be written down? K'mezor nechshavu. What will happen now is that they are going to control it. And therefore, we are so blessed that we have the Torah Shabbal Peh, which, as you said, Unkelis is maramis to, or Unkelis can be understood in light of the Torah Shabbal Peh. And again, I just want to mention, by the way, what Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz answers in his Yoris Dvash to the question about earlier. He says, in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, the translations were perfect. In other words, because they had a Havana Amitis. He seems to assume, Rabbi Yonasan does, the multiplicity of Pshatim, although it becomes part of Torah, is the type of thing that God sort of gives us a good check for. In other words, the opposite of the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer says that this multiplicity and the multiple aspects of Torah is really what the Torah is meant to be for every generation. Rabbi Yonasan says actually the opposite. He says, even though it's true, God recognizes that we're doing our best, and Elu ve'elu divrei Chaim, but at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, they knew what was klor, the Havana, and therefore those translations that were done by the experts and were definitely 100% correct. Interesting how the various Rabbanim of generations and the Midrashim themselves seem to have sort of a nuanced view of translations. Let's talk about the most famous translation before the English translations that we know about. You mentioned Kahanas, and of course the translations here in the 20th and 21st centuries, and of course is the 18th century translation of the Torah known as the Be'er, written by Moshe Mendelssohn. Now, Mendelssohn had a team who helping him in terms of the actual interpretations that were on the page. And I have a copy of the Be'er. I have the second edition. I don't have the first. I have the Zollenbach edition. And I also have from 1840, which was the Vilna edition of the Be'er. And as much as people consider it, an apikarsis type of book, and Chas v'Shalom to have it, Rav Kiveger had it in his house as well. A very famous story of the Chassam Sofer and Ricky Vaker. So the Be'er, basically worked on by Mendelssohn. It's an interesting thing, Yitzchak. Mendelssohn, of course, was well known as a critic, a philosopher. He won first prize in the German contests for original philosophical tracts. I think he was picked over Immanuel Kant. And he was very, very famous. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, of course, extolled him in the play Nathan the Wise. Mendelssohn was a breakthrough personality. He represented for so many people something that belied the canard that Jews are uncivilized, that Jews cannot be in high culture, that Jews cannot be trusted. He was universally loved. Rabbi Yonasan Ivishus, I just mentioned before, even gave him a ksav haskoma, which is very close to a smicha. He gave him sort of like a ksav, which we have a copy of that and printed in Kerem Chemed, a Haskalah journal of the early 19th century that they discovered. In his private writings, he talks about how he has to stop writing now because it's Shabbos is coming. I don't know if he davened in a minyan or wore a yarmulke all the time.
I remember hearing a story that he was traveling somewhere and it was almost Shkia, and he had to stop to daven mincha, and then they said, "What difference does it make?" He said in his whole life he never missed mincha, before Shkia.
And it's clear from his letters that he was, again, he didn't go to shul necessarily every week. Neither do I, and neither do you. But the point, though, is that why he was moved to his translation, as Alexander Altman points out in his magnificent biography of Mendelssohn, is because he was suffering from terrible migraines and headaches, which might have been indicative of a brain tumor because he died relatively young, and he was not able to concentrate on the philosophical tracts that he was writing. So his brain was still working. He says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to work on a translation, which he felt had less intellectual rigor that was needed for that than what he was working on in terms of classical philosophy that had been his bread and butter up until that. The truth is that his idea was, he looked around and he saw that there was already a lack of interest. There were tefillos that were going on in shuls when he did show up, that the congregants didn't seem to understand what the Torah was about. So his idea was, and those of you that have a Mendelssohn Bayer can see, was to write the Torah over where we have sort of Onkelos on the side. He had the Targum Ashkenazi in Hebrew letters, German words in Hebrew letters. And this was, in a way, to make what he felt sort of like Yiddish, like the Beis Yehuda Chumash or the Tzena that would make the Torah understandable to the masses. That was what he felt he was doing. He felt it was a positive thing. He appended to it.
It's interesting because in high school, history class, they taught us the opposite. They told us that Mendelssohn's purpose in translating the Torah to German was to teach Yidden who already knew Chumash to teach them German, as opposed to Rav Hirsch, who was teaching the German Yidden Chumash because they didn't know Chumash anymore. But what we were taught, and again, maybe it was wrong, but it was that at that time, most Yidden, they knew Chumash, but they didn't know German. I know one of my...
I think you're correct that there was an element of that as well, to bring out some who were not aware of the German language and to help them. I think that was part of it. But I think there was an element that was already disenfranchised. Most of the time, you're right, from the frum historians, you're going to hear how Mendelssohn lit the fire of Haskalah and was the father of all the terrible things that occurred. My good friend Avi Shafran wrote an article in the Jewish Observer in the 80s, mentioning, Mendelssohn's religiosity and talking about the mistakes Mendelssohn might have made. The very next issue, the Jewish Observer had to issue an apology for writing an article that somehow gave Mendelssohn any sort of distinctive props at all. The Novominsker Rebbe decided himself that he was going to, despite his respect he had for Avi Shafran, he was going to slap it down. So I think there has been for years a demonizing of Mendelssohn, especially as, people know, of course, about his grandson, of course, the amazing, amazing composer Felix Mendelssohn, who was Geschmatzach. They know about his daughter, Henrietta Hertz, who also had a salon where men and women frolicked around and were involved in all sorts of prostamaisim. And basically, we have, after two generations, we have Mendelssohn's children all basically living as Christians. Mendelssohn himself, though, stood very firm when Lavater, the priest, demanded that now that Jews have been given equal rights, that Judaism should basically dissolve and that Judaism should now join Christianity. Mendelssohn wrote his defense of Judaism called Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, which is, a defense of why Jews must still keep the Torah. It's not necessarily our Ruach. It's nothing like Hirsch at all. But Mendelssohn saw himself as a staunch defender of the faith. He didn't see himself as dissipating it. I should also tell you that Mendelssohn's Hakdama to the Chumash, which I think is sometimes called Orla Nesiva, the Be'er was called Nesivas HaSholom. Nesiva Shalom, isn't that interesting? The Spitz Chassidish Sefer today was what Mendelssohn referred to as his Be'er, Nesiva Shalom. So he has a introduction to the whole Torah called Orva Nesivasi, which is an incredible introduction about how the different Mahalchim and Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Soid. And also he wrote, even before, sort of as he was working on the Be'er, he wrote a beautiful Hebrew commentary on Koheles with an introduction, which is appended to the Be'er on Chumash. I'm not going to say that he was an Achroin as a Pesach. In fact, Rav Yaakov Emden was very upset. In Denmark, there was a call to have halonas mesim. As you know, there was a case where someone who had gone into anaphylactic shock and appeared like they were dead, and then it turned out that the person had actually been buried alive, or so they came up with a gazetz that you had to wait three days for every person who had died. Remember in the morgues they would put bells on their toes. I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's right. In case they would somehow become unparalyzed, so people would hear it. And when Rabbi Yaakov Emden was turned to by the Jews in Denmark, he said, "Look, it's definitely we're being over an aveira of halonas mesim. We should definitely have an intercessor who will come and defend our right to do things according to our religion, based on the mitzvah of lisol nivlos el eitz, to bury as quick as possible. But I'm going to ask Mendelssohn to get involved because he knows how to deal. He knows the language, and he's very respected." So Mendelssohn decided to roll up his sleeves and do the sugi himself, and he actually was machriya the other way. And which Mendelssohn and Rabbi Yaakov Emden engaged in a sort of a machlekes. Mendelssohn said if it's true that it's pikuach nefesh, then even it's halonas mesim should be nidcha machmas the possibility of pikuach nefesh. So just a little bit of an aside here about Mendelssohn and his Be'er, but it was condemned at the time. There were many Rabbanim, even though Cedric Yeager had it, there were many Rabbanim who felt that this was a step in the wrong direction. And this ultimately, even Mendelssohn's Be'er, the translation was one thing. The interpretation, other than the first Parsha Bereshis, was done by Mendelssohn himself. After it was done by the great scholar, Shlomo Dubna, who ended up printing his own. Yitzchak, he did his own translation of the Chumash, again, based on his interpretation. By the way, Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg, the Ksava Kabbalah, when he printed his first Chumash, it was also printed with a German translation based on his Be'er. And Mendelssohn himself used for his commentary on Sefer Vayikra, it is one of the most prized commentaries that was written by Rav Toli Hertz Wiesel, or called Wesley, that very much deals with the Rishonim and the Toras Kehanim. Really the king of scholarship, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, makes continuous use of Wiesel's Perish B'Mikra. And of course, Wiesel would never have gotten the job. He was just a Malamed had Mendelssohn not chosen him to do this work.
I think, when it's unfair that they blame Mendelssohn for so much of the damage. I think the bigger damage really came from the cut shot. That's really where the Sabbateans...
You're talking here about the Shapsi Tzvinikos who...
and then subsequently the Frankists.
Right, and of course they were ready to use any means to get to their secret ends, including, of course, acting in the most irreligious ways possible. I think what we see here, Yitzchak, is that when translations occur, there's a mixed reception. The translation of the Torah, again, we talk about, of course, the Christian translations. You mentioned that the JPS translation of the Torah was not yet there when Kahana wrote Torah Yeshara.
Well, no, actually, there was originally the 1917, which was more the style of King James, or the Revised Standard Version. And then when Kahana made the Torah Yeshara was just when JPS came out with their second version, I believe it was 1962, and then he made the Torah Yeshara in 1963, and then the JPS made another translation in the 80s, and now recently they came out with a more liberal, gender-neutral translation that avoids calling God he, things like that. That's come out more recently and has drawn a lot of ire from those of more traditionalists, which I share that ire. And not only that, but I looked at it and it's not not a very good translation either. The fact of the matter is, I personally like the 1917 version. But the interesting thing was that when Rav Hertz from England made his Chumash, he originally actually published it with the Revised Standard Version, which was before they got permission to use the JPS version. And then once they got permission to print it with the JPS, that became the standard for really all not only the Hertz Chumash, but all the Sensino books of the Bible used the 1917 version, even when it was subsequently revised with a little bit more frummer version through the Judaica Press, and they somewhat merged Judaica Press and Sensino. There was the Judaica Press Tanakh, and then there were, which probably one of the better ones with the whole Rashi translated, a lot of with the Mikras Gedolos, everything on the page and other things there with the Haskama from Rav Moshe. And then it came out, there was somewhat of a merger between Judaica Press and Sensino, that the second edition of the Sensino books of the Bible were done more frummer, took out all the Goyish references that were in the earlier versions of the rest of the books, except for the Sensino Chumash, which is, using the same translation, but because they felt that Rav Hertz already did his version that was so eclectic, but still nonetheless frum and with strong Orthodox apologetics, then, when Rav Cohen came out with his was much more according to really only quoting, I think mostly Rishonim only, or some of the major Achronim and the Mikvah Gedolos, and that was his approach.
Right. And you're right. When I was growing up in Shul, those were the two Chumoshim that our Shul had. It was either the Hertz Chumash or, you're right, the Cohen Chumash. And I remember some of the college kids reviling me, with stuff that was in the Hertz Chumash, because they knew that I was a very frum boy, and they asked me, well, look what it says over here, and it talks here about evolution and other things like that, which of course I didn't have much of an answer for at that time.
Well, he wasn't a very liberal about evolution. He was more middle of the road, but particularly what I
even find a place where evolution can somehow be aligned with the Torah.
Though, was his apologetics against the documentary hypothesis of higher biblical criticism, showing how empty it was, and he brought very strong proofs, against that, and that was, I think,
if you're already in the Bible critics camp, and this is why what David C. Hoffman did was so incredible. You already sort of have to admit that what we're talking about is the documents that were sort of stitched together from different periods. It's almost like Lahavdu Yisro and Hamas, for Hoffman to write, his Perish on Vayikra and on Dvarim, and, going into, what all the Bible critics were saying and disproving them in his book against Wellhausen, and still remain the great Pesach Lamed Hoyle is really, really incredible. It shows his brilliance and his elegant writing.
And I think it was more necessary at the time because in the English-speaking world as well, and why Rav Hertz needed to do that was because it was so...
Their arguments were being heard.
I mean, when I look at it, you just look at the Chumash that we have and the way it is, and I think this is, to me, the greatest apologetic argument to the Kadmos and the originality of Torah Sinai, is that, very simply, we see all the Chaseris and Yuseris and the Kriyan Ksiv, things that do not follow standard grammar in Dikduk and Lashon HaKodesh, that are all throughout the Chumash, and how that changes, the later books of Tanakh in certain ways as well, though. But nonetheless, if there was a redactor, as the Bible critics claim, he didn't do a very good job editing. It has to be Min HaShamayim, and it has to be something much deeper.
Because if it was an editor, he sure did a lousy job contradicting Perek Aleph to Perek Beis of Bereshis. Yes.
Not only that, but just the spelling and the grammar and everything else.
I just want to end today with, on Friday, we'll be having a very rushed Erev Shabbos, and of course this is going to drop next week, but we'll have read in the morning the Slicha from Rabbi Yosef Ibn Ev Yosser, also known as Ben Shatnash, who was in Muslim Spain in the 11th century, and was known as one of the great Paitonim, and also a Pesach, and he had a Bezdin that they actually don Dinei Nefoshos. Incredible person, Rabbi Yosef Ibn Ev Yosser. So he is the author of the Payat, Esker Matzok. And I just want to mention, much is made out of his Payat, Esker Matzok Asher Kara'ani. I'm going to remember this the straits that attached itself to me, in other words, the whole Jewish people. Ba'arba makos b'chodesh zed dika'ani. There are four things occurred. Of course, there's a lot of different nuschos, but four is crucial here. There's four things that occurred that sort of got me down. Gideani, it sort of cracked me in half. Dika'ani, it depressed me. Heniani, it moved me. Hichani, pained me. Those four things. Ad ata hilani, the pasuk in Eov. Up until now, I don't know if I can take it. And now you have the next one, which again, you have Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Here's Dalid. Diachani, and of course that is the term, the Hebrew term for extinguishing. I was extinguished, like a light that was extinguished on the eighth day. Smolis vi yemonis. I was extinguished on the eighth to left and right. Halo shlosha yomim. Nikbati bitanis. There were 3 days that have been established as a fast. Umelech yovon anasani lichtov dos yevonis. V'al gabi, and on my back, charshu charshim, the plowers, they plowed my back. Irichu lemanis, like they were using me, push me into something I didn't want to do. So here we have a description of dichani, which is again being extinguished, which again is a remez to the light being expunged. It's almost as if like the reason for the 3 fasts are almost all contained in what occurred. Even though this happened after the actions of Asar B'Tevis, Rav Sadia also is credited as a Paitan as well, and you can find in his Siddur, which is also found in the B'nai Roma, the Roman Machzer on Asar B'Tevis, they say his Payat, and I'll read you some of it. It's called Oz Ba'ozvi Mikra Dos. It's when I left the religion from the Torah, me'eso es, bechol zman lehigisi alichaisav. I didn't really work on concentrating and really think enough about the learning. Ga'al nitzuri. So God was disgusted by me. Alkein maseso eves, dika'ani l'saper tzoros. And therefore, I turned away from Torah. God brought sorrows on me. Hayom nosari misvucho. Basically, what Rav Sadia ends up saying is what happened in Bayis Rishon and Sheni, it seems, Ta'isi acharei gilulim v'chol tavnis. There's Tes. Yehirim oz hiriku bichera v'chonis. We were attacked. It's not like by doing Avodah Zorah things got better. Kol seruchi b'chodesh zeh k'shenichta v'torah yivonis. My spirit was in a way almost extinguished. L'chein v'yimash choshech shloshes yomim ugezartim tainis. So once again, you have Sadia really confirming that this comes on the heels, Yitzchak, of I guess a lack of learning, a lack of, it wasn't necessarily because of that occurred. The way Sadia seems to see it is that the Bnei Yisrael was sort of asking for it. It sort of was happening already. It's almost like what was the chicken and what was the egg. We had already, in a way, sort of abdicated our role the way it should have been, and that's why, again, we have the Torah being translated to Yavonis, despite the beauty of the Greek language, the fact that so many Jews were proficient in. Okay, so even though they might have been well-meaning in coming there, what they ended up doing was providing that community with an excuse and a way, a nesiva not l'shalom, but a nesiva for his blameless. You sort of got to commend what they were able to do. They stood their ground. They were definitely distinct in a way, but they got a lot of things wrong.
I think, as we both agreed, I don't know how much, how much Hebrew, like Philo. I don't think he knew any Hebrew.
Or Philo Alexandrian. His works are magnificently written, and they're so interesting as he sort of redoes the life of Moshe Rabbeinu and the Avos with midrashim that we aren't aware of, but his interpretation of various mitzvahs seems to not align with what we know.
Not only that, but just it seems to bear out in ignorance.
Right. When he tries to explain why the names, one of the things Philo does is describe why each person, why Noach has the name Noach. He doesn't seem to understand true Lashon HaKodesh. So we have to be wary, again, of translations. And I think that's, let's put it out there. There's so many people who feel, despite the incredible advantages of what ArtScroll has made for so many people to enter into the learning of Gemara, there are many people who feel that it has become much more than just an aid. It's become a replacement. And there's so many kids out there who they can't move without an ArtScroll. They feel helpless. Although you might say the Talmud needed help to the point that these successful translations, Yitzchak, sometimes become like the Frankenstein monster, and sometimes or a golem out of control, and it ends up changing things way beyond what the translators ever meant, and it actually could become a replacement, really, of authenticity. So
I'll say one thing in conclusion related to that, though, was that today was the yard site of the Ishbitzer, the Meishelach, and his son, the Beis Yaakov, has a beautiful idea that basically, it's not quite what, Lahavdil, some of the other religions talk about progressive revelation, but so the idea of Das Torah, it's not that we're trying to uncover what was intended, that what Hashem said 3,000 years ago, and we're trying to uncover is that when we follow our Masorah, and we follow our Chochamim, we follow our Gedol Yisrael, we follow the Tzaddikim, that this is what Hashem is telling us today. And so it really doesn't matter. When it was brought up, this question, I was talking to another subject with this ger. I said, how crazy the idea is that the Septuagint could be earlier. And he said, well, let's say it's not crazy, because, the Masoretic text, as we have it now, was only, written down later, and we know, what it was, even though we do believe, of course, it was a Masorah of why the name Masoretic comes from. But nonetheless, the Sof Kol Sof, he said, it shouldn't matter. If we're Yidden, it doesn't matter what we read, what we should be, totally connected to our Masorah and to Yiddishkeit, and nothing should be able to shake us away from that. And so while I think we have authenticated the authenticity, of course, of the Chumash.
Not that we needed it. I think unlike our previous programs, I think we sort of disauthenticated the Targum Shivim today. I think that's what we could say.
We didn't need it. We're solid in our Yiddishkeit no matter what.
Well, it was definitely interesting to examine the statements and to think about, not to get caught up with the allure of things easy.
But to recognize, we could all fall, and so we have to daven to Hashem that we should continue to follow in the right way.
Yes, amen. Be well, everybody. We have definitely disauthenticated the Septuagint. Watch out for that dust on the way out. We'll catch you next time. Be well. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you liked what you heard. If you did, please take a moment to share this or any of the many episodes available on our platform with friends in order to help grow our community. Until next time, Shalom.